Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be going through an introduction to JavaScript. This is going to assume that you've been through the kind of the basics, the 150, 250 type courses, and so you have a basic understanding of programming. And so we're going to be able to focus more, not so much on the structures of the language like loops and if statements, although we'll briefly go through those, but more on the changes in the syntax and kind of the environment that runs in, namely being the browser. So to begin with, we have to understand something very important. That is that our websites depend on a client-server relationship. That is, the browsers initiate a request to the server, and the server sends a response back to the client. What is sent back to the client is the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript. That JavaScript then that is sent back is the actual source code. It is up to the browser to take that source code, interpret it, run it, and execute it in the client. And so as we go through the web and we browse websites, our browsers are executing that code constantly throughout the day, through almost every page that we visit. We have two types of programming languages then, or they live in two different general areas when we deal with programming languages and web development. That is the server side, where the server hosts the code. That code is never seen by the client. The server is executed, that code is executed on the server, it generates part of the response. That would be like PHP and .NET, and we'll be talking about PHP here a little bit later. The client side then is this other stuff, the stuff that we've been talking about so far in the course, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Here's a diagram showing the server-side, client-side process. And again, the important thing to understand, and what you'll see today as we look at some of the examples, is that code is returned to the browser and the client, and then that browser is what executes that code, right? So we have this client-server relationship. The server-side code, when I request a page, and let's say that it involves a server-side script, like PHP script, so I request, page.php, that code is going to execute on the server, and it may in part generate HTML, CSS, and or JavaScript as part of that response back to the client. JavaScript is a subset of Java, and so we're not going to go into all the details between the two languages. If you're familiar with Java, and I believe most of you will be, then you should see a lot of similarities between the two. Java is compiled, JavaScript is interpreted, and the reason, or the primary reason for that, is because that source code, the JavaScript itself, is returned back to the browser, and the browser is the one that executes it and interprets it. So it's a much different delivery mechanism. How we get JavaScript into our pages then is through the script tags, predominantly through the script tags. And so you'll see in a lot of code that we're going to have these tags, script, embedded within the page. These script tags can really be anywhere in the page. You'll predominantly see them in the head section, but you may also see them throughout the body. Best practice is to put those in the head section. And just like with our style rules, if we're going to put style rules in an individual page, we want to keep those organized. We want to put those in consistent places, so it makes it easier for us to maintain them, or for anybody that follows on and looks at our code or maintains or enhances our code to find those as well. There is a type attribute on the script tag, and this is oftentimes defined with text/JavaScript. However, with HTML5 and HTML5 browsers, this attribute doesn't need to be included. And so all the code samples that you'll see that I'm using will not have that. It'll just be a script tag with no attributes. So you may see the script tag in older code. At this point moving forward, unless you have a specific reason to support that for older browsers, you don't need to do that, and it's safe to remove it. Okay, you'll see in these example slides, though, that type attribute is there. Let's see, two-sided tag, all right, so script, and then the closing portion for that opening tag, and then the JavaScript is going to go in between these two tags, right? When we use a script tag, that means we're defining the JavaScript within the document, right? When we talked about style sheets, about CSS, we can use style tags to define styles within a document as well, right? We have other ways to do that. We can link to external JavaScript files, and we'll go through that process, at least how to do it. You'll see it's very similar to linking to an external style sheet. It's very simple. What you'll typically see in an application then is, just like with style sheets, a lot of the application, the JavaScript, will be contained in external files, in external JavaScript files, and the application will just link to those, and there won't be a lot of these script tags within the document itself. Usually the JavaScript in a document is relatively minimal because it just is going to link to an external style or an external JavaScript file. Predominantly done to help keep the code organized, right? Just like we organize our code into classes or into libraries, We also do that with the JavaScript, and we'll have JavaScript that provides functionality for user interaction or for shopping cart functionality or something. However, we'll do that. We'll organize that code into external files, and then we'll link to those files on the pages that need that functionality. Okay. Inside of the script tag, then, it consists of a series of statements. This is what this is how we write our code. It's the JavaScript function declaration, variable declaration, arithmetic expressions, whatever our code is. It's a statement, it's a command, and we're going to combine those statements or commands in order to make that coherent or cohesive experience for our users. Okay, we have a couple of different things we're going to start talking about, and some of them will start off very simple with document.write, which allows us to write text to the screen. We're going to really kind of hold off on the really good JavaScript functions until we talk about the DOM, which we'll do, if you look at the schedule, we'll do that immediately after talking about or kind of wrapping up our introduction to JavaScript, because the DOM and JavaScript is what really gives us that ability to make our client-side experiences, our applications, our websites very interactive, right? So document.write, we'll take a look at this example in the source code that I have uploaded, or the sample code that I've uploaded. This is just giving us the ability to write text out using JavaScript anywhere within a document, anywhere within a page. And while you'll generally want to avoid this, this is just kind of a good place to start to get used to writing some JavaScript, especially JavaScript that modifies the way that the page looks or adds or removes content to the page. In this case, document.write will always add content to the page. It's going to write content wherever this is called. And we'll see a sample of that here in just a moment. The syntax, right? So my assumption is that you're familiar with at least a programming language and you understand the basics of it. And so as we start to move into different languages, so if you've never programmed with JavaScript before, but let's say that you've programmed with Java or you have some PHP experience or C# or something, once you have the fundamentals down, moving around languages is relatively easy. The tricky part most of the time is figuring out the syntax. And so here are some basic rules, maybe some of the differences that you've had from other languages with JavaScript. JavaScript is case sensitive, so you do need to pay attention to that when defining variables, calling functions, and things like that. For the most part, it ignores most occurrences of extra white space. So if you put a lot of padding or white space in between an equal sign or a function call or something, for the most part, it doesn't really matter. Now, again, we try to avoid that just to make our source code easier to read and easier to maintain, but it's largely ignored. We don't break statements into several lines. Each statement is on a single line, and if you need to break things onto several lines, about the only thing you can do is when you break up string concatenation into several lines, and I'll show you an example of that here in just a moment. All right, so let's see. Let's take a second right here. This is our class folder. So you have course material, sample code. Inside of the JavaScript folder, under sample code, there's basic arrays and basic JavaScript. I'm going to be we'll start looking at the basic JavaScript file. So that's the one that we're about to look at here. Let's see. So basic JavaScript. Okay, this is our a basic HTML page. So you can see we're at the bottom portion of it right now. That's the closing tag for the head. This is the opening for the body. We want a script. So we can define a script tag just like this. And we can define those script tags really anywhere we want inside of the head and the body. Again, general rule, best practice, we try to avoid these script tags directly in the body because it gets harder to find those. It gets a little bit harder to maintain. And if we put them in the head section, we typically put them in the same area because you'll notice if you start doing more and more web development that the head section can get pretty busy. There's a lot of meta tags that you'll use and style rules possibly and links to external style sheets and external JavaScript and a lot of stuff. And so you want to keep this well organized. We don't have the type attribute. You may see a type attribute defined like this, text JavaScript. Right? That's fine. That's kind of the old way of doing it. The HTML5 way, most modern browsers assume if you're using a script tag that you're going to use or define JavaScript. And so you don't need to do that, and you can actually remove that moving forward. Because what's inside the script tag is now JavaScript. This has to be syntactically valid JavaScript. And so we can say something like document.write and then a string value. String value simply being any content in between these two double quotes. Right? This is a statement. This is a command. Each command in JavaScript has to end with a semicolon. And so you're going to see that value there. Very common with any programming language as you're getting started to forget things like semicolons and curly brackets on function declarations or if statements or loops or small syntactical errors that can be kind of tricky to track down. We'll talk a little bit about debugging here, I think, here in the next lecture. So if we run this script, run this page, and I'll go ahead and save that, and I'll just double click this to open it up with my browser. You can see that it wrote, I told it to write this paragraph tag, this content, in between the body. And so if we look at that tag, we can right click and inspect element. You can see there's that paragraph and there's that content there. So it simply wrote it at the point in time that the browser encountered it. The browser is processing this file from the top to the bottom, right? As the DOM is loaded, we'll talk more about the DOM in just a couple lectures, but as the browser loads this content, loads this document, loads this web page, it's starting at the top and it's working its way to the bottom. And so as it encounters the body tag and then the script tag, it's going to just generate this content, then the closing body, then the closing HTML. Right? Here's a slightly more in-depth example. We'll go through this here after we've talked through a couple more slides. We're in the head section, and you'll see the only thing I want to point out right now is that we have, again, our script declaration. If we want to write JavaScript, whether it's in the head or it's in the body, we have to define the script tag, opening tag, closing tag, and then the JavaScript in between. Okay, so one of the first things that you'll do, and you'll do relatively frequently with JavaScript, again, as you do with any language, and I'm trying to establish some of the commonalities here between what we're going to do with JavaScript and what you've done with other languages. One of those common things is going to be declaring variables. And a variable, all it does is it tells JavaScript, tells the interpreter to reserve a little bit of memory for that variable. JavaScript is a little bit different when it comes to variables in that we don't have types. Right? The type of the variable is going to be determined by the value that is assigned to it. And so JavaScript determines this at runtime. This can be a little problematic, especially if you've never worked with this before, because it gives us more opportunity for the values of our variables to be something unexpected. And so we have to be a little bit more aware, a little more cognizant of that, and a little more proactive in how we approach variables and the types and the data that we're expecting to pass to functions and things like that. Variable declaration is very simple in JavaScript. We use the var keyword and then the name of the variable. And pretty generic or pretty general variable rules are in place here. I think you can use, there's only certain characters you can start a variable with. I think it's underscore and then an alphabetic character. And then the variable name itself is alphanumeric characters, I believe. Let's see, variable names, we'll talk about functions, right? We have the ability to give our variable names and our function names good names, descriptive names, and we want to do that. It's very important that you do that, because if you give the name to your variable, it can give a very good indication to somebody that's reading your code, including yourself, what the purpose of that variable is. And it makes your code a lot easier to read, right? And that gets a little bit more in the weeds of software development and stuff, and there's other courses that cover that in more detail. But I do really like to stress that and point that out, that whenever we're talking about variable names and function names, be purposeful. Have those names mean something so that they add clarity to the code that you're writing. This declares a variable, but it doesn't assign a value. And so we have two ways in which we can declare variables. We can just simply declare it, var, and then our variable name, or we can say var variable name and assign it an initial value. So we declare it and initialize it in one statement. Single equal sign, again, very common syntax for an assignment operation. We do a single equal sign, we're assigning the value on the right to the variable on the left. And then with JavaScript, the type of this value, whether it's a string, a numeric, or a Boolean, will determine the type of this variable. Okay, working with data types in JavaScript then, as we're dealing with variables, it's very important to understand these types. There's four primary types, numeric, text, Boolean, and null. And so those are only the four values that we really deal with. Now, numeric can include things like float and integer and double, but it's numeric at the core. Text values, string values, that's the next primary type. Boolean values, so you have true or false, and you can actually use those keywords, true or false, for those values. And then null values, so null, or you might also see them being undefined. You must declare a variable before using it, right? When we look at PHP a little bit later on in the course, what you'll see with PHP is that you can use a variable without declaring it. You can use it, and the PHP will treat that as the declaration if it hasn't previously been defined. That's not the case with JavaScript. You can't use a variable until there's been a var and then the variable name, a declaration statement somewhere in your code. All right, so let's go back to our example here, and here I have immediately going against the recommendation that I just gave you. And that is I'm using poor variable names in this particular instance, but it's okay. This is just some sample code. Var A, var B, var C, and var D. And so I've declared these top three and initialized values, and then this bottom one, I have not assigned a value, but I've declared the variable. A equals this. This is a string value because I use these double quotes. Double quotes represent a string. You can also use single quotes. B equals true, so Boolean. The other option there would be false. C equals 0, or some other numeric value, right? So there's our variable declaration. We have variables, and because of these value types, that determines the type of this variable. Okay, another thing you need to be very aware of with JavaScript is that it's weakly typed, which means that things don't always happen the way that you would expect them to. A perfect example, or a prime example of that, is a statement like this, in that we use something like the plus operator. And in some languages, plus operator means, arithmetic addition only and nothing else. And so if you take two numeric values, 5 plus 4, you'll get the result of that addition. You'll get 9. So the value of this total variable will be 9 after that statement's executed. However, with JavaScript, you can also use that same operator for string concatenation. That is, string concatenation is taking two string values and then combining them together, right? It's just like we're smushing these together. So this variable, emlink, would have the value after this statement operates of cadler@mpl.gov. Right, this would be one string value because all three of these individual strings will have been concatenated together. So with something like the plus operator, the context, the values that are being used in this operation will determine whether it does addition or it does concatenation. If one of the operands, right, so if we have addition, we have a left and a right. Right, so there's two values that we provide to that operation. If one of these is a string value, then it's going to treat both as a string and it's going to do concatenation. Right? If both of them are numeric, then it's going to treat both of them as numeric and it's going to do addition. Okay, so just you have to be careful with that because sometimes you can do an operation and you get unexpected results, and it's because of this weakly typing of the language. All right, and let's just look at an example of that real quick here. So we'll get to the rest of that code. You'll see that I'm going to do console.log, and I'll show you where that output is generated to. This is just a relatively rudimentary way of doing a little bit of debugging or providing output through a JavaScript, not in the browser window itself, not to the actual document or the DOM model, but to our developer tools. So let's say that we have let's just do two values direct, right? So we'll skip having variables. We'll just log the output is, and then I'll say 5 plus 5, right? So this is probably a pretty good example. Before we walk through that, let's go ahead and we'll open up our browser again. I've already got the developer tools, and so when we want to start using this console.log, we go to the console tab, and let's refresh that page, right? And there's that output, right? Ignore the rest of that for now. We'll come back to that in a minute. The output is 10, right? So there, that output was generated to the log. What happened? Well, you can see that I used that plus operator in a variety of contexts. The first, I used the parentheses for order of precedence, right? So we know that when we want to have a bunch of numerical operations, mathematical operations execute, that if we need to change the order of precedence, multiplication and division have a higher order of precedence than subtraction and addition, we can use parentheses to do that. And so I did that here. I added a higher order of precedence, and I say that when this code is executed, this has to go first. So JavaScript looks inside of this parentheses, it sees two string values, adds them together mathematically, then it looks at these two. So it looks at this plus operator and sees that this is numeric, the result of that operation is numeric, and this is a string. Since this is a string, it concatenates, and that's why we get the output of output is plus 10. Okay. what happens if I do this? Okay, let's take a look. Let's refresh this page. All right, output is 55. Right? Might not be what you were expecting, because 5 is numeric, 55 is a string, because I wrapped the 5 in double quotes, and so it treated this as a string value, so we got concatenation, and then we got concatenation. Right, so that's what I was talking about there. You'll see I'll use console.log a lot, and it's just an easier way, I think, in my opinion anyway, an easier way to generate some output here for us to do a little bit of debugging, to understand what's happening in our code versus using an actual debugger. All right, a couple more slides, and then I'm going to wrap up this first introductory video. Creating a function. Functions are critical, and particularly in JavaScript and with web development, because the way that we often, you're going to see that JavaScript and web development is event-driven. And so we're going to have events, things like button clicks and hover-overs and form submissions, and that's going to need to call a code. And so a lot of our JavaScript is contained within functions, right? We'll have libraries, external JavaScripts, where all they are functions. Functions are a series of commands that will be called or they'll be executed when a function is called. And so functions at this point shouldn't be anything new to you. Just like other languages, functions can return a value. They don't have to return a value. So with JavaScript, that's the same. The function name should identify the function. Functions can have arguments, and those arguments can be 0 to a relatively large number, although I would advise you not to go that route. I would advise most of your functions to contain relatively or as few as arguments as possible, because we want our functions to be very specific, and the more data they take in, typically that means the more that they're trying to do. And so we want to try to limit our function arguments to 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 at the most. The type, those functions, those arguments kind of have the same rule as our variables. That is that we don't define the type, we just define the number of arguments and the name of those arguments in that function definition. So be purposeful when you give that function a name or that argument a name, because we can't define the type, and so we need to be able to convey to the people that are looking at our code what this function is expecting. So between the name and the arguments, the number and the actual name, it should give someone pretty good understanding of what that function does. Okay, and just like in other languages, once you define a function, that function is not called, that function is not executed until it's called. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple functions here. I'm going to comment this out just to eliminate some of the output to console.log, and we're going to look at, let's see, we'll take a look at do something, right? So function do something, right? Again, relatively bad function names just because we're going through some examples. This function declares these two variables. This should not be a variable declaration because y has already been declared, right? So we'll fix that right now. This declares two variables, and then it assigns to y the sum of y plus x, and then console.log logs the sum is. Right? So this code exists. It does something relatively simple. It doesn't return a value. It doesn't take any arguments. With JavaScript, we have the function keyword, the name of the function, and then the opening and closing curly brackets. And so those curly brackets then define the statements, these statements that belong to this function. Right? Just like with variables, we don't define the return type here. So with a lot of languages, you define the return type, whether it's void or it's an integer, it's a boolean or a string or whatever it returns. But we don't do that with JavaScript. We just declare it as a function and then give it a name. If we want to call that function, right, we have to do that somewhere in our code. So we'd say do something, semicolon. That's a statement. That statement calls this function. And so if we refresh our page, we should see at the top of the output here the sum is 10. And does that make sense? Yes. 5 plus 5 is 10. The sum is 10. Right? Plus operator, string, numeric. These values are all numeric because these are numeric. This plus this is numeric, so the result of this is numeric, so this remains numeric, but this is string, so this performs concatenation. Right? And then we see that value being logged through console.log. So we know that it works. We called the function there. Okay, what about functions that return a value? Well, we use the return keyword. We say return in conjunction with a value. Okay, so let's take out those double quotes and say that this function returns a numeric value, then if it returns a numeric value, if we don't do something with that value, then it's kind of pointless. So functions that return a value, you can assign that value to a variable or pass it to another function as an argument or whatever you need to do with it. So I can say something like var val equals the return value of our call to return something. And then just to show that it worked, we'll just log that value. And if it worked, we'll have the value of 99. Okay, so we'll go back to our page, refresh. It worked, 99. Right? This function did something. Right? In this case, I trivialized that. I didn't put any other additional logic in here. I just said it returns a value of 99. But because it returned a value, we can do something with that return value. We can put that in our code and do something with it. Right? So that's what we did here. Okay. The last one that we'll look at then is this function, what is the type? Right? So this is, again, function declaration. This is a much better name, and that I'm trying to indicate what this function is doing by the name itself. What is the type? I could say, what is the type of the object? This would probably make it better if I said argument 1 is, object 1. And if I go ahead and do that, I do need to change some of my code here. But I think that makes it clear. If I say, what is the type, and then the value or the name of that first argument is object, then it's clear that this function is going to determine the type of an object. Right? So arguments, we have 0, we can have many. Right? We don't have to say var, we don't say the type, because we don't do types with JavaScript. And so if you want to have multiple arguments, then you just have a comma-separated list of objects, or of argument names, sorry. Right? So in this case, we just have the 1. And what this does then is it uses or goes through this if-else-if statement to determine, or simply log to console.log, what type this argument is, what type this object is, whether it's a number, whether it's a string, a boolean, or it's undefined. There is some built-in functions, and you'll start to explore those more as you get into JavaScript, and we'll look at a little bit, although we're going to cover a lot in the course. We're not going to probably go too deep with some of these. Type of is one of those. And so this is a function call that returns, based off of this object, a string value that equals number, string, boolean, or undefined. And so we're using that as a way to determine what type this object is. This is a pretty common if statement. If statements are, again, something you should have been exposed to in 150, 250, or an additional intro to programming course. We have a condition, and we use a comparison operator. So we're saying this is equal to, we use 2 equal signs here instead of 1. Right? 1 equal sign is assignment, 2 equal signs is comparison. We say that if the return value of the type of function is equal to number, then we log to console.log, argument is a number. Right? Because this is an if-else-if. As soon as one of these conditions are true, we execute the code with that condition, and then we're done. In some languages, the curly brackets are optional. JavaScript is one of those languages. So if you have one statement inside of an if, or an else-if, or an else, then you don't need to have the curly brackets. And I oftentimes do not include the curly brackets just because, I don't know, it's just a pattern I got into. But you could include the curly brackets. And if this needed to have more statements than just the one, then you wouldn't need the curly brackets. Okay, so how do we call that? Well, now we have the 4 function calls. Since this doesn't return any values, I don't have to do anything but call the function, and I'm providing it the value of these 4 variables, or I'm providing actually those 4 variables themselves, so A, B, C, and D. Right? And so that's where that output is coming from for the rest of that console.log. It's a string, it's a boolean, it's a number, it's null. Right? And that makes sense. It's a string, it's a boolean, it's a number, and it's null, it's undefined. It's a declared variable, but there's been no value assigned to it. Alright, let's see. Creating and calling a JavaScript function. So we talked about that. We talked about creating functions, function keyword, the name of the function, the parameters, the arguments that we use, curly brackets, the statements inside. We talked about calling them. We also talked about functions that return a value. I think at this point we'll stop and call it good. We'll go through the next video then, the last half of these slides. We got about halfway there. Look at some more sample code. But again, it should relatively be an introduction, right? We're going to talk about arrays and a couple other things, and you should already been exposed to arrays. And so this is just kind of looking at them With that, I will talk to you guys in the next video. Thanks.